Well, we've been in a series called Leverage, and this is our second to the last week. Next week is going to be our last week in this series. This is week number 7. Next week is the last one, and then we're going to jump into a Christmas series that I think is going to be awesome. I think it's going to be a whole lot of fun. I think it's going to be something you can easily invite your friends to. We're going to be talking about hope. We're going to be talking about what it is you might be hoping for this Christmas, and as a matter of fact, what it is you might be hoping for in the world. So next week, we're actually going to be dealing with the other half of a tough decision we're dealing with today, and it's going to lead us on into our conversation about hope as we go into December. But today, I'm going to be dealing with a tough decision that, for some of you, is present reality. For some of you, happened a couple times before in your life. And for some of you, hasn't happened yet. For those of you who are students in the room, especially high school, junior high, and college, what I'm about to tell you today is perhaps one of the most important lessons you will ever hear in your life. For those of you who are adults, you've been through this, and you look at the other teenagers and the other college students and that kind of stuff, and you say, looking back, yeah, that's what he's talking about is one of the most important things that I ever had to deal with in my life. However, even as adults, you're still dealing with it. It's just, we've grown to a point where we say, oh, I can handle it. I can deal with it. I'm okay with it. It's not affecting me like it affects some younger people. All of us have to deal with this. And this decision is tough. Now, we've been in a series called Leverage, and Leverage is really trying to apply a certain set of principles to the tough decisions we face. We face all kinds of tough decisions. You know, we've been talking about them. The decisions where this path and this path each lead down a fairly good path, and you don't know which path to take. You're stuck here in the middle, and you're not sure which decision is the right one, and so you're stuck. That's a tough decision. Or then there's the other kind of tough decision where I know path A leads to God's will for me. I know path B leads to not God's will for me. What am I going to pick? Well, path A isn't very fun. Path B is very fun. And so I want to pick path B, but I know I should pick path A. And that makes it a tough decision. So how do you deal with these tough decisions? Well, let me just remind you of what leverage is all about. There are 3 principles to any lever. Number 1 is the principle of stability. Something's got to be strong, attached to the ground, strong, so that when the lever moves, it's moving against something, and it doesn't just fall to bits. Stability is number 1. Number 2, you need a pivot point. And the pivot point is that area in the middle of the lever around which the other things move. And then finally, you need a push in the right place. If you're playing seesaw with someone and you are much larger than the person you're playing seesaw with, it matters where you sit on the seesaw board. If you sit a little too far away and the other person is far away, it's going to be like that. And so you have to put the push in the right place to get the movement that you want to happen. Now, we looked at these 3 concepts metaphorically to apply them to our decision-making process. And stability metaphorically means I have to be firmly committed to something. I have to be so firmly committed to something that it's beyond me. That when I want to do A, but I should do B, I'm so firmly committed that what I want doesn't matter. And it's easy for me to decide against my wants because my convictions are so strong. You know, you already have some convictions like that, where you regularly choose against one of your wants because you're convinced by something. So convictions, stability, that's the first thing. The pivot point is that you need to learn something new. Every decision that you face is largely, it's tough because you don't know all the answers. And so you need to learn something new. That new information comes into you. It pivots your brain just a little bit. You get a new perspective, and then you can move forward. And then finally, the push in the right place means you need to have good relationships. You need to have good relationships because a person who's in your life can push you and help you to get moving down the right path. Okay, now I went through all that review because of this one thing. If you have the right people around you, then you can get pushed in the right place. Then your brain can pivot in the right way. Then your convictions come to the surface, new, and then you can pick the right choice. But what if you don't have the right people around you? What if you have the wrong people around you? If you have the wrong people around you, then the push goes into the wrong place. And then, because the push is in the wrong place, your mind is being kind of snowed by the perspective of the wrong people around you, and you don't get the right perspective, and you're not pivoting correctly. And then your convictions look less important because, after all, the people around you don't care about them either. And so just by having the wrong people around you, it can totally destroy everything else you've worked for. Having the wrong people around you can lead you to making exactly the wrong decision just because the wrong people are around you. I want to share with you the fact that today we need to make some decisions about the people around us, and it all begins, our time today really begins in 1 Kings chapter 12. There's a story about a guy named Rehoboam, and I got to tell you the backstory a little bit before we look at these verses. If you've got your phone open, you ready, you can just read some of it right there because I put most of it in the live event. But if you've got your Bible, you could read it there too. But so here's the story. Rehoboam is the son of Solomon, who is the son of David. And if you know that part, then you know enough. But let me just go a little further back. So here's Moses. He takes the people out of Egypt. He leads them out of Egypt. They come to the wilderness where they are supposed to begin following God, and they're supposed to enter into the promised land God gave them. But they say, no, we don't want to follow you, God. And so God says, fine, wander around till you all die. Your children will go in because they'll be sick of the desert. So then they wander around for 40 years in the desert. All the adults kind of die, and then the children come up and they're like, we're sick of the desert. So now Moses is also dead, and Joshua comes along, and he leads the people into the promised land, this area where God had prepared for them to be. But they don't do their job in the promised land, and they don't push aside all the other people. Instead, they just start living like the other people who are there, worshiping their idols, doing their things. So then for 400 years, they're going through this up and down thing where the Bible tells us in the book of in the book of Judges, that everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And it's an amazing story. You really should read your Bible, because in Judges, it's an amazing story where it tells us at the beginning of the book, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And at the end of the book, it says everyone did what was right in their own eyes. But you know what happens in between? A whole lot of until the very end of the book, where everything wrong that can go on happens. The book of Judges, just chalk this down, the book of Judges is Murphy's Law in the Bible. What can go wrong does, and it all happens because everybody does what they think is right. File that away somewhere. Anytime you do what you think is right, eventually it leads to something wrong. Just file that away somewhere. It happened. So anyway, we come out of the book of Judges, and everything is in shambles. The whole nation is just terrible. And God says, okay, it's time. Let's go ahead and do the king thing. And so he brings in a king to try to put the foot down and try to get everybody to do the right thing so that now they're actually doing what God says is right, not just what they think is right. And the king comes in. His name is Saul, and he's actually a loser. And so pretty soon God says, okay, I'm done with Saul. Let's move on. He finds David, puts David into the position of king. And David is a great guy. He is following God. The Bible tells us he's a man after God's own heart. His heart is right. He writes half of the Psalms, and the Psalms are all these worship songs about God. But David is also a warrior. So he's both a warrior, and he goes out and he conquers nations, and he's also really sensitive to the things of God. And so he's kind of halfway in between two worlds a little bit there. And so God says to David, towards the end of David's life, listen, David, I love you. I know you love me. I know you want to build me a temple. But I'm not going to let you do it because your hands are too bloody. You've been in too much battle. And I don't want the world to think that I'm a God of war. Even though you've been at war for this whole time, I don't want the world to think that I'm a God of war. I want the world to know that I'm a God of peace. And so you can't build the temple. But I'll let you raise money for it. So David raises all this money for it. He dies. He gives all the money to Solomon. Solomon comes on the scene, and God gives Solomon amazing wisdom that he can do. He's just brilliant. And so most of the book of Proverbs is written by Solomon, all these wise sayings. We're going to spend some time in Proverbs today. So anyway, Solomon comes on the scene, and he's super wise, and he's super rich because David has raised all this money for the building of the temple. Solomon builds the temple. It's one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. It's amazing, gold everywhere. And he's so wise, people come from all over the ancient world to listen to him, and when they get to him, they bring money. So Solomon is getting money just flowing into the nation constantly. And he uses the money. He buys horses, and he builds a palace, and he gets women, and he's got 1,000 of them by the time he dies, and literally 1,000 women in his harem. And of course, he's got to pay for them all. So he's using all this money and all this stuff to pay for all the women and all the horses and all the palace and all the gold and all the everything. He's just got to keep everybody happy. But he dies. And Rehoboam comes on the scene. And if you know anything about history, you know this thing to be true. Whenever the king is super rich, the people have nothing. And that's what was happening. Solomon built a temple. It was amazing. But when he built the temple, all the people brought all their gold and all their valuables to him to put into the temple. So he put it into the temple. Now they don't have their gold anymore. They don't have anything valuable, just their land. They're trying to make do. They're trying to get, but now the kingdom is so huge. And Rehoboam is now the new king. And he's not nearly as wise as his father. And no one's coming to see him. And no one's bringing gold from Africa to see Rehoboam. And so now he's got to tax people to keep the palace going. Because everything, government is just so huge. You got to raise the taxes, make the thing happen. There's no political statement in there. I'm just saying. So anyway, he's got to keep the taxes going. And the people come to Rehoboam and they say, dude, your dad was so hard on us. Could you please lay off? Could you please give us some relief? A man named Jeroboam comes up and he's the spokesperson for the people. He says, can you just give the people some relief? And Rehoboam is faced with a tough decision. Do I lower my standard of living to under my father's, or do I keep putting the thumb on the people so that I can keep doing what I'm used to do? So he talks to some wise people. He needs some leverage to make this tough decision. We pick up the story in 1 Kings chapter 12. Here it is on the screen. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. How would you advise me to answer these people, he asked. Great. He's going to wise people to get some counsel because he needs leverage to make this tough decision. They replied, if today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. Think of the wisdom these people are saying. If you serve your country today, they will serve you forever. Such an amazingly wise statement. Be kind to them today. Give them what they're asking for, and they will serve you forever. So Rehoboam's got a tough decision to make. And he's got all the leverage he needs. I didn't tell you this, but back in Deuteronomy chapter 17, you know what it says? It says, the king of Israel shouldn't get too many horses. The king of Israel shouldn't get too wealthy. The king of Israel shouldn't get too many wives. And finally, the king of Israel, when he begins to be king, he should copy the entire first 5 books that we call the Pentateuch, or we call the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy. He should copy all these books down by hand and read them every day so that he will not think he's better than his fellow Israelites. He had the perspective, he had the text, he had the stability he needed in that Old Testament. And you know what? His dad didn't follow that. His dad had lots of horses, lots of women, and lots of wealth. And we don't know how often he read those first 5 texts. But you know what? Rehoboam was down a little bit. At least he had it there. He had the text. He could have it. And he had the people around him who would give him all the support. Rehoboam had all the leverage he needed to make this decision correctly. But he ignored it for the sake of some dudes. Check out what happens next. 1 Kings 12:8. But Rehoboam rejected the advice of the elders. He rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. He played dodgeball with these kids in elementary school. And now they've all grown up. He's the king. They're his buddies. They're all hanging out together. They're all in the palace. They're all in the temple, all doing their thing. And Rehoboam is like, you know, these old fogies over here, they tell me I'm supposed to serve the people. And then they'll serve me. What do you guys think? And you know what the guys tell him? Literally, they tell him some just crass stuff. They say this. They say to him, Rehoboam, you go back to them and you tell him, my father beat you with whips. I will beat you with scorpions. My father put a heavy burden on you. I'll put a heavier burden on you. In fact, they say this. Tell them, your father Solomon's waist euphemism, is smaller than your pinky. That's what they say, literally. They say, you go and tell them that your little pinky is bigger than your dad's manhood, and you prove to them that you're the better man. Because you're Rehoboam, your father, who cares what he was? You can be bigger. And the guy says, I like the way you think. And he tells the nation of Israel exactly those words. He gives to the nation of Israel exactly those words. He says, listen, I'm a bigger man than my dad. I'll prove it. Here we go. I'm going to put my foot down on all y'all, and that's the end of it. That's it. You know what they do? They say, fine, be that way. We're not your servants anymore. See ya. And they leave. Jeroboam becomes their new king. 10 tribes of Israel separate off. They follow Jeroboam, and only Judah and the tiny tribe of Benjamin stay loyal to David's family. And that's the way it lasts for the rest of history. Rehoboam ruins the nation because he listened to his buddies. That's it. So now the question to us really comes down to our relationships, our friendships. And the Apostle Paul has something very interesting to say in 1 Corinthians. He says this, do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. We like to think it's backwards. We like to think that good company can make bad characters better. We like to think that if I'm a really, really good friend, then these bad characters around me, I can lift them up. I can make them better, right? So I'm going to keep hanging out with them. I'm going to keep doing the thing, but I'm going to keep a little bit of distance, just a little bit of distance between me and them, do something, because I think that good company can raise bad characters. And yet Paul says, don't be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. It goes deeper than that. Because see, I know that for those of you who've been in church for a while, I'm talking like this, and there's a part of you that says, okay, I understand this whole idea of watching out for bad relationships, but there's another part of your brain that is beginning to question, and you're beginning to ask this question probably specifically, that says, but didn't Jesus tell us we're not supposed to judge people? Didn't Jesus tell us we're not supposed to judge others? What do I do with that? Well, here's the deal. I'm going to give you some perspective. But before I give you some perspective, I want to give you a hard and fast conviction. Here's the hard and fast conviction. Write it down. Each friendship is a decision for my future. Each friendship is a decision for my future. Every friend you allow to stay in your life is a choice you're making for the kind of future you will have. Because if bad company corrupts good character, and you continue to flirt with bad company, then your character is going to shift little by little over time. And your future will be determined by the friends you have. So, let's jump into finding a little bit of perspective. Jesus tells us something very interesting in the most famous passage about not judging people. It's in Matthew chapter 7. I want to read it to you. Matthew 7, Jesus says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye?" This passage is so popular that even unbelievers who've never studied the Bible, they've never learned anything about Jesus, they don't go to church, anything like that. People all over the world, in the United States at least, Western world, are familiar with this whole idea of take the plank out of your own eye. You know, this concept is actually quite familiar. And we always use it to focus on the don'ts. Someone tells you something's wrong with you, you look at them and say, "Hey, take the plank out of your own eye, mister. Don't judge me." Or the super Christians are together, and they want to talk about one person in the room who's got a real serious spiritual problem. And they're saying, "Well, we can't talk about that because, got to take the plank out of my own eye first," which basically means I never touch you. I never get to do anything about the stuff in your life because Jesus told me I'm not supposed to judge. Well, Jesus says this next. He says, "You hypocrite. First, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Jesus actually says, no. It's not wrong to judge the other person. It's not wrong to see that there's a speck in someone else's eye. What's wrong is trying to remove it while you got a log in your face. That's wrong. So go ahead and get that out enough so you can see clearly, and then by all means help your brother or sister to deal with their stuff. And then, okay, so that's the famous, that's the easy, that's the nice and packaged, tangible thing. But there's this other verse that comes right after it that kind of freaks me out. Jesus says this very next. He says, "Do not give to dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces." He was just talking about human beings evaluating each other. Now he's talking about dogs and pigs. And the question you need to ask yourself is, did Jesus change the subject? Or is he still talking about people? Now, stand back just a little bit, because if he's talking about people, this is Jesus. Your Savior died for the sins of the world because he loves you so much. And he calls human beings pigs and dogs. That sounds judgmental. That sounds harsh. Why in the world would Jesus say this? Effectively, the farthest we can get with this right now, I don't have a lot of time to just dig into it, but Jesus is basically saying there are people in this world where you give them your best and they will stomp it. There are people in this world where you pour out your heart and they turn it back on you. There are people in this world where you give them friendship and love and they tear you to pieces. Don't do it. And then to top it all off, Jesus finishes his entire message. Because see, this is really part of the Sermon on the Mount. This is this famous passage where Jesus tells people how they should live in the kingdom of God. And Matthew 7 is the last chapter. And this is the next to the last concept. Because after this, when you hit verse 15, as we're going to see in just a minute, he says one extra thing. And then after that, he talks all about this final concluding idea. If you hear my words and put them into practice, your life will be stable. If you hear my words and don't put them into practice, your life will crumble. That's the whole man building his house on sand, man building his house on a rock. If you don't know the story, you should read it. Matthew chapter 7. It's really interesting. But so in this is what comes immediately before that. So Jesus is ending his whole message by saying, if you hear me, you should do it. And if you don't do it, then you're messed up. And before he says that, he says this: watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. Let's keep going. He says this: a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. This is the passage where we get the whole wolves in sheep's clothing concept. Have you ever heard that before? Jesus is talking about people who look like sheep, but inwardly they're wolves, and they're going to get you if you give them too much of your time, if you get too close to them, if you pay too much attention to them, it will devour you. And he says this to finalize the whole thing. He says it twice in this passage. By their fruit you will know them. You will recognize them by their fruit. Take all this stuff and pull it together, and you have this one basic conclusion. Jesus is commanding you to evaluate your friends. He's commanding you to evaluate them. Not to condemn them, not to say you're going to hell, but to say I'm going to evaluate them and figure out what's going on. And he says you will evaluate them by their fruit. Write this down. Evaluate your friends by the fruit of their lives. Now already, we haven't even come to the list of bad fruit and good fruit, but you already know someone. And in your head, you're thinking this thought: is that a bad friend? What's the fruit of their lives? Is this a person I need to keep hanging out with? Well, listen, I don't have time to dig into any of these things, but you can see there are a whole lot of blanks left over on your note sheet if you're using that thing. Because I'm going to flood you with a bunch of bad fruit and some good fruit and a bunch of Bible passages, and I'm just going to read these things and race through them, and you're just going to have to write down or tap as fast as you can or whatever it is that you're doing. Because this is some bad fruit. And if you know someone who has these character qualities, you need to seriously consider whether or not their bad fruit is anything you want in your future. Check this out. The first one is divisions. Bad fruit is divisions. That means if you have a person and every time they're talking about the world, it always seems like they've got an us versus them mentality. They're always creating lines in the sand. They're always dividing themselves from other people. And wherever they go, they find themselves in an us, where others are in a them. And it's like their whole world revolves around this. Cut the lines, make the divisions. See what the Bible has to say about that. Titus 3:10 through 11. Warn a divisive person once, and then warn them a second time. After that, memorize this line. Have nothing to do with them. Oh, but they're just my Facebook friend. No. Have nothing to do with them. You may be sure that such people are warped. I love this. This is the time in the Bible where the Bible calls people warped. It's just beautiful. I love it. They are warped and sinful. They are self-condemned. Warn them once, warn them a second time. After that, have nothing to do with them. Do you know a divisive person? Have you warned them? Twice? Move on. The next bad fruit is anger. Anger. I counsel people, and every now and then I'll have this lady come, and she's worried about her relationship with her husband. It's either a premarital counseling situation, or it's someone who's like, I've got this issue I'm dealing with, and quite frequently what comes up is that their husband every now and then yells at them, gets angry, or something like loses his temper. And in many cases it's like excuses are being made for it. Well, he's just got a quick temper. It happens now and then. I pushed his buttons, and sometimes it's vice versa. Sometimes it's the lady who's all screamy and the guy is a little bit more calmed down or something. And she's losing it all the time. And do you have a friend who, when you're riding in the car, they think the other cars can hear them? Do you have one of these friends? And then when they realize the guys in the car next to them can't hear them, they just talk louder? And do you have one of these friends? You need to let them know that the guy next to you has a subwoofer and his windows are up and he doesn't even care. He just can't hear you. So, road rage, anything like that, check out this verse. It goes like this, Proverbs 22. Do not make friends with a hot-tempered person. Do not, memorize this line, associate with one easily angered, or you may learn their ways and get yourself ensnared. This isn't about them hurting you. This isn't saying don't be with an angry person because they might turn their anger on you. No, don't be with an angry person because you might catch it. It might bleed into you. Run away. Next, bad fruit is gossip. Gossip. I know some of you wouldn't have a friendship if you stopped gossiping. So that's the only thing that's keeping you together with some of these people. You send the email back and forth. Did you hear what that person did? And then the next day you're talking to the person that you're gossiping about the other person that you were just gossiping with. And that's how your triangle works. It's just, that's what we do. But gossip, check it out. There's a reason why gossip is bad fruit. Here's the verse for it. Proverbs 16:28 and 17:9. A perverse person stirs up conflict, and a gossip separates close friends. Whoever would foster love covers over an offense, but whoever repeats the matter separates close friends. Here's what gossiping does. Gossiping takes your good relationships and drives a wedge between them. And you lose the good relationships, and then you're left over with just the gossipy ones. Because gossip always creates a circle. And as long as you're okay with that circle, everyone outside the circle, that's them. We're us. And we can keep the gossip flowing in this circle right here as long as we're talking about them. But if you had a good friend who's in the circle, gossip eventually gets in there and it just cuts it apart and separates it. Next, bad fruit, deception. Oh, but he just tells me little white lies now and then. It's not a big deal. Oh, she tells me most of the truth most of the time, and just every now and then just kind of hides a little bit of something. I've learned to overlook it. I've learned to put it behind me. I don't really worry about it anymore. Well, check out what it says in Psalm 101. David says, "No one who practices deceit will dwell in my house. No one who speaks falsely will stand in my presence." David says, I've got a restraining order against all liars. The judges won't give you one, But if you go, you go to the judge, you'd be like, hey, this person lied to me. I'd like a restraining order. It's not going to give it to you. But that's what he says he does. No one stands in my presence if they've lied to me. That's just it. Let's move on. Another piece of bad fruit, disloyalty. Disloyalty. This is one of those people who they stab you in the back and then a week later they come back and tell you they're sorry. They stab you in the back, and then a week later come back and tell you they're sorry. And it's like, don't you ever support any of your friends? And, well, Jesus told me to forgive them 7 times 70. That's 490. I haven't really reached 3 yet, so I guess I got to forgive them one more time. And that means bring them back into my life. Maybe so, maybe not. Forgiveness is one thing. Trust is a different thing. We can talk about that some other time, but look at this verse. Proverbs 18:24 says this, one who has unreliable friends soon comes to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. I got to ask you, if you don't have a friend who's like a brother or sister to you, they're out there. You just haven't found them yet. There is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And all the others, look for that one. Another bad fruit, and this is the strongest piece of bad fruit that you should watch out for. It's unbelief. In 2 Corinthians 6:14, Paul says, do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? See, what Paul is doing there is he takes this word fellowship. And fellowship is a uniquely Christian word. Fellowship means a family friendship. Fellowship is when it's like you and I live in the same house. It's like you and I do life together. That's why we emphasize our life groups, because we want you to have not just buddies or acquaintances or Facebook friends. We want you to have fellowship with people who love Jesus. And we want you to have a relationship with them that you get together with them as many times as you can. That's fellowship, it's family, it's relationship. But Paul says you can't have that with someone who doesn't even share your basic beliefs. You can have an acquaintance with them, you can have a relationship of some kind with them, but you can't have fellowship with them. He says there is no fellowship if you don't even share the same beliefs. If you don't even recognize that God is God, and He sent His Son, that we could be saved and have eternal life with Him someday. That's some bad fruit. If you know some people with some bad fruit, you probably need to have nothing to do with them. You probably need to somehow find a way to say goodbye. Some of you here today, you might be dating someone, and they're in the bad fruit category. That's a tough decision you're going to have to make. Some of you, maybe you're in a family relationship where there's a member of your family who's in bad fruit, and you're wondering, well, I can't leave the family. What do I do here? How do I apply that? Well, listen, hopefully by the end of our time today, I'll be able to give you just a hint, just a tiny little hint of some practical things. And then you're going to have to work out those practical things in your life groups this week and dig into those relationships that you do have that you know are good, so you can figure out how to deal with the relationships you know are bad. So let me tell you what a good relationship looks like. Let me tell you what a good fruit person looks like. Real quick, here they are. Number one is confrontation. When you're looking for a good friend, you need to find someone who stands toe-to-toe with you and can point you in the chest and say, listen, I think something needs to change. Look what it says in Proverbs 27. Better is open rebuke than hidden love. Better is go ahead and put that up, Charlie. Better is open rebuke than hidden love. Wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses. You got someone who always tells you great things, you might want to look for someone else. Wounds from a friend can be trusted. Good fruit is confrontation. But on the backside of confrontation is this next word. It's encouragement. Jot that down. Encouragement. In Proverbs 27, the same chapter we were just in, but verse 9, so a couple verses later, it says this. Perfume and incense bring joy to the heart, and the pleasantness of a friend springs from their heartfelt advice. See, someone who confronts you doesn't just say, you're a loser. Someone who confronts you says, here's something. It's burning in my heart to help you find the answer. It's burning in my heart to help you see the truth and to lift you up into it. And it's their heartfelt advice that brings you up, encourages you, and takes you to that place that says, okay, yes, I can do this. They're giving you the push in the right direction. Keep going. Other good fruit is support. In Ecclesiastes 4, 9 through 12, I won't read it, but it says that 2 people are better than 1. And at the end of this passage, it tells us that 1 person might be able to fight a few people, but 2 people can fight a ton of people. And it says that 1 can be overpowered, but 2 can defend themselves. You want a person who enters your battles with you, not just someone who stands off to the sidelines and be like, hey man, let me know when you get that thing taken care of. In the meantime, I'm pulling for you from over here. You want someone who gets into the battle with you, can stand next to you and say, hey, I don't really know where this is going, but I'm going to be here. That's support. 2 more pieces of good fruit are proximity. And by that, I actually mean physical closeness. Proverbs 27:10 says this, do not forsake your friend or a friend of your family. Do not go to your relative's house when disaster strikes you. Better a neighbor nearby than a relative far away. The passage is telling us, listen, if you hit hard times, you don't want to have to drive 4 hours to get to someone who can loan you $20. That's really not going to help you. What you want is you want a neighbor. You want someone near you. You want someone close to you who loves you enough and supports you enough. So here's a little piece of good fruit. Are they near me? Yeah, that's some good fruit. One last one. It's godliness. Godliness. In Psalm 119, verse 63, it says this, I'm a friend to all who fear God, to all who follow your precepts. David is writing as a prayer to God. He says, I'm a friend to all who fear you, to all who follow your precepts. But Jesus said it even better. In John chapter 15, Jesus says this. It's beautiful. He says, you are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I've called you friends. For everything that I learned from my Father, I've made known to you. Jesus himself says, if you follow my Father, I call you friend. You want people in your life who are committed to following God. And if you do, call them friend. Call them friend. So, let me give you one final thought. A little bit of push to help you take this home. And I can't really give you a recipe right now for how to end a relationship. I still have one more thing I think might be an encouragement. I can't give you an end of the relationship talk, But I can at least help you this far. With this line, hopefully you'll remember it. Do not befriend a pig. Let this be your advice for today. On Tuesday, someone will say, what'd you do over the weekend? I went to church and I learned that I'm not supposed to befriend pigs. And they're going to say, huh? And then you tell them about our church, then you invite them here, and then you say, hey, Christmas is going to be cool, we're going to be talking about hope and everything, and I'm talking to you, and I'm not telling you whether you're a pig or not, I'm just inviting you to don't befriend a pig. Now, in practical terms, there's one major thing that you need to get as we conclude this time together. I didn't put it on your note sheet because I wasn't sure I was going to be able to get to it, but I'm going to get there anyway, just because it's so important to me that you know this. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Because see, I've been telling you all about the people you need to stop paying attention to. And yet, there's a world out there of messed up people. And if we stopped paying attention to all the bad fruit people, how are we ever going to bring the message of Jesus to people who really need it? Because you all know people who are outside of the faith. You all know people who don't care about God, and their lives reflect it. And there's bad fruit falling off those vines like every single day. And you see it time and time again. So how do you deal with this? Do we just let the whole world go to hell while we say, hey, we're cool, we're going to heaven, and we're not going to deal with them, have nothing to do with them? Okay, are you ready for this? 1 Corinthians chapter 5, this is the thing that slaps you in the face. Are you ready? Paul writes this. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. See, he's telling us who to not pay attention to. He's telling us who to defriend. He's telling us who to cut off. He says, I wrote to you about not associating with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters. In that case, you would have to leave this world. Paul says, listen, I'm not talking about outsiders. I'm not talking about unbelievers. I'm not talking about people outside the church. For you to disassociate with a world like that means you got to kill yourself. Don't do that. He's saying, I'm not talking about that. See what he says next. He says, but now I'm writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or slanderer, a drunkard or swindler. Do not even eat with such people. Paul says it's the believers that you really judge. It's the believers you pay attention to their fruit. The people outside, sure, whatever. You can't even judge them. Check out what he says next. He says, what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Expel the wicked person from among you. This is where it all comes together. This is where Paul brings it all together. He says, listen, there's bad fruit people, there's good fruit people. There are people you need to cut off, and there's people that you don't need to cut off. There are people you need to bring into your life, and there's people you need to push away. And the only place where you get to make those calls are in the family. You know someone who claims to be a believer, and they're a bad fruit person? Tell them once. Tell them twice. And be done. You know a person who's outside the church, and they've got bad fruit falling all over them? Let God deal with it. You just bring to them the message that changes lives. You don't need to tell them they need to stop doing what they're doing. Listen, if they could stop doing what they were doing, we could all stop doing what we're doing. And we wouldn't need Jesus to come in and forgive us and cleanse us and give us His Spirit to strengthen us. The fact that people who don't know Jesus keep doing the stuff they're doing is that they've got no power. And you've got the power. You can bring it to them. Next week we're going to talk all about this idea of making the tough decision to actually take this message that Jesus has given to us and bring it to others. That's what we're going to be talking about as our final tough decision. But today, I just want to leave you with this. There are people in the church that you need to do a little bit of evaluation and say, have I warned them? Have I warned them twice? Am I still hanging out with them? They're claiming to be believers, but they're not doing anything with it. The fruit is bad. But then, for those outside, for those who are unbelievers, maybe some of you here this morning, you're like, man, I don't know which camp I fall into. Well, I tell you, if you don't know which camp you fall into, then you probably need to do some investigation. Say, hey, maybe today's the day I need to figure this thing out for myself. Come and talk to me or Billy or tap Kevin on the shoulder as he puts his guitar down or something. But if you know that you're in, you have to obey this. If you're not in, you don't need to obey this. It's just good advice. But if you know that you're in, you have to obey this. And you have to say, listen, I'm going to pay attention to the people who are in my family, my spiritual family, and I'm going to challenge them. But for those who are outside my spiritual family, I'm just going to love them. Let God deal with where the fruit falls. I'll give you two last little bits of advice. Jot these things down, and then we'll go to our time of reflection. When you're dealing with someone who's not claiming to be a believer, and you have to identify what kind of relationship you have with them, here are two things to keep in mind. Don't expect or trust too much. Because if you expect or trust too much, and they let you down, then you might start blaming them. When the reality is, they just simply don't know grace and forgiveness and the power of God yet. So don't expect or trust too much. Secondarily, don't get too close. Don't fool yourself into thinking that, oh, if I'm just a really super awesome close friend, you know, like the lady who thinks that marriage will convert her husband, because after all, he's going to premarital counseling and they're getting married in a church, and then 30 years later, he still doesn't care. Don't think that a relationship will cause a person to come to faith in Jesus. Relationship is a key component, but it doesn't do it. Don't get too close. So let me just bring all this down to one final conclusion and leave you with this. You have relationships, and God wants you to have great relationships. He wants you to have healthy relationships. He wants you to have good-fruited relationships. And it's time for you to decide, am I going to invest in the good-fruited relationships? Or am I going to continue to allow the bad-fruited ones to infect me? Where does that come down in your life? What kind of decisions need to be made? What kind of practical realities need to happen? Who should you talk to next to get some advice about all this? As the band comes forward and we sing our final song, I want to give you the opportunity to jot some ideas down on your Connect card. And I'm going to be clear with you. Put something down on that card and say, Jeff, I need you guys to pray for me about this. I have a relationship that this. Pray for me about this. And this week we will pray. Let's pray now.
Thank you for listening to this message from Lafayette Community Church. We believe that God has a full and fulfilling life in store for you, and we want to help you live it. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, Pastor Jeff, through the web form at LafayetteCommunityChurch.com. And as always, I encourage you to plug into a solid, God-honoring community wherever you may be. Life is a journey, and no one should ever walk alone.